I'm a principal at Bloomberg Associates and also a board member of the Regional Plan Association. Very pleased to be here today with a distinguished panel, as they all are. Starting from my far left, Chris Ireland, the Director of Infrastructure Investments from the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, DJ Gribben, Managing Director of the Macquarie Group, Bob Yarrow, who I'm sure in this room needs absolutely no introduction, and probably the same can be said for Sam Schwartz, a man who needs no introduction beyond his name in this world. We have been tasked with talking about what I think the morning really hinged on, which is financing the solutions. We heard numbers ranging from a minimum of something on the order of $10 billion just to preserve existing capacity, to numbers that when you add them up, they get into the $40 billion range for a whole slew of ideas. These are numbers that, frankly, nobody has any idea where the money's going to come from. And having been involved in plans and transportation advocacy, nowhere near as long as Bob and some of the others, but I've seen enough plans come and go in my time that we all know it hinges on whether these things can get funded. And of course, I do think one of the topics we'll wind up touching on this hour is that really it should have been financing and funding the solutions as much as just financing it. But I think I'd like to start with the two gentlemen on my left who represent investors. And I think Ronnie Hakim mentioned the role that the private sector can and should play in financing this. We heard a couple of comments about institutional issues. We heard the issues of prioritization. And of course, from the Undersecretary, we know that the federal government is there to be a partner, but there is no imaginable scenario in which the federal government is going to pay the lion's share of a project like this. So two people who know the New York area, who know the world of infrastructure. What do we do?
That's a big question. First, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Chris Ireland. I'm with Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. We're based out of Toronto, and we have about 150 billion Canadian dollars under management, and we invest that in a variety of assets, including right now we have $12 billion invested in infrastructure around the world, including places like Australia and Chile, the UK. One of our largest investments is container terminals, of which two of them are in the Port of New York and New Jersey. We own the Staten Island Howland Hook Terminal, formerly called Howland Hook, and we own the Bayonne Terminal in Jersey City, Bayonne area. And that's how I get connected with the Port Authority. So we're very comfortable investing in infrastructure. We like long-term investments that we can own, that we can add value, that give us long and stable returns. And for that, we usually bring in experts, or we're experts ourselves in that field. And we're comfortable owning it alongside the public sector or governments, and we do that in locations around the world.
Did you want to hit on where do we start in this process? Or?
Oh, yeah. So I mean, where do we start? It's a big question, but certainly, if you're looking for private equity investors to come in, or infrastructure investors, there needs to be something that's for sale. First of all, that's the biggest thing. So we need to believe that there's going to be a sale process. The government is going to part with it or sell an interest, and there's going to be a revenue stream that we can evaluate and take a return on that. And so beyond that, we can establish our own views on how that asset or revenue stream is going to perform. But that's probably the first step, is to figure out where's the revenue going to come from over time, and what's our relationship going to be with that asset in that region.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So again, my name is DJ Gribben. I work for Macquarie Capital. My focus, Macquarie is the world's largest private investor in infrastructure. We have about $100 billion invested in infrastructure worldwide, about 100 different assets. My job actually is I work on the investment bank side of it. So I will represent people that are looking to investors who want to invest in infrastructure. We have our own funds, so we'll represent our own funds, we'll represent third-party funds, and I actually spend most of my time representing governments who actually want to attract investors in infrastructure. So prior to coming to Macquarie, I served as both the general counsel for USDOT and the chief counsel of the Federal Highway Administration. So I spent about 2 decades working on public-private partnerships and sort of innovative project procurement, and currently represent 4 different governments who are trying to attract private investment around greenfield assets, where they want to build something new, and around existing assets like Chris touched on. So when you think about it, and there's a fantastic opportunity here. I mean, if you think globally, where do investors, what are they looking for? What geography, what kind of political culture, what kind of legal structure they want to invest in? United States is extremely attractive place to invest. And if you think about it, as Chris mentioned, you're looking for, as an investor, opportunities where there are assets that are likely to be able to come on the market. So if you think about the U.S. as being extremely attractive, this region is probably the most attractive region in the U.S. So globally, this region is already starting with a significant leg up on the rest of the world in terms of being able to attract investors here. So with that as a starting point, okay, well, where do you begin? You're a region, you have significant infrastructure needs, you want to finance these. I start off by reminding people that public-private partnerships aren't magic, right? There's no way, if you have no money, when you do a P3, you will now have money, right? So that's just sort of simple math, but you'd be amazed. I've actually had to explain to governors in the early days that private investment comes in, that's very good, but you have to pay them back. And you usually have to pay them back with interest. And so let's just start with, there's no magic. That said, they are wickedly efficient, especially when compared to traditional government procurements. So you can take an infrastructure need and basically take 15, 20, 25% of the cost off the table if you do a P3. In addition, you shift significant risks, including future maintenance, right? So lots of times we have a bad habit of building beautiful infrastructure and then not maintaining it. If you have a public-private partnership, not only have you paid for the cost of building that, but you've also prepaid the cost of maintaining it for generations. So huge advantage there. If you're this region and where do you start, I would start by looking at what you have, right? You already have assets that are generating revenue that can be monetized and that will release significant value if they're in the private sector hands. There was a book called The Mystery of Capital written by Hernando de Soto that talks about how property rights around an asset actually changes the value of that asset. He didn't talk specifically about P3s, but I think it's analogous, and that is oftentimes what we find is there are toll roads or there are utilities or there are assets that are in public ownership. That same asset in the private sector is worth considerably more, and the public sector can then take that increase in value by shifting to the private sector, we can talk in more detail how that works later, and take that value and reinvest it into core infrastructure. So if you're thinking about this region, how to improve this region, start with what do you have already that may be of more value in the private sector's hands than the public sector's hands. And one of the speakers in the last panel said, users of infrastructure don't really care who owns it. Like you get on the train, you don't care who's actually operating that train. And they said, whether it's the MTA, Amtrak, or somebody else, and I would add private sector onto that list, right? If there's a private operator, the user's not really going to care. So think about assets you have currently, ways potentially to take out value out of those assets, and then also kind of on the operations side. I know former Mayor Bloomberg looked at a number of opportunities to save money in terms of operations. That operation money, captive capital, those are all resources that are available to build new infrastructure that don't require an increase in taxes or increase in tolls or increase in utility rates. So let me just stop there because we have more panelists.
Although, DJ, I do want to push you on something that, so does that really mean that it makes sense to start recycling our assets into the private sector? That whether it's the Port Authority's portfolio, the MTA's portfolio, somebody we really should be thinking of getting rid of by auctioning off or privatizing certain assets so we can fund the things that we don't have the revenue to fund right now?
Yeah, I had a long intro, so I'll just say yes.
Great.
to that question. But,
I just want to put a fine point on it, because
Yes.
honestly, I mean, as you've identified, I think one of the challenges we face with P3 is people love to talk up here, and then all of a sudden, when you get down to what it actually implies, it gets.
before I'm going to steal this back from Chris, before I just add one thing, and that is you don't have to sell it, you can lease it. And one of the things we found is that's very powerful is the public doesn't like public infrastructure being sold to the private sector. But back to we don't care who operating our trains, there's better policy probably just to lease it. You can capture almost all of the same value and then still reassure the public you're not selling the crown jewels. Yes, you got a good price, so I think it's much easier to lease it over time.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, we have experience in buying infrastructure assets that are operating, such as, a great example is in Europe, a lot of the airports are privately owned, and the private sector focuses on quite different things than the public sector does, but they don't make for a worse experience. In fact, the airports there are actually a lot more comfortable, a lot more enjoyable. There's other services that are offered, and there is continual investment in those. And then, that's just a pure, take what you have, sell it off today, have somebody else run it better, if you will. The other example of recycling capital is something called High Speed 1, which is in the UK. It's an asset that is owned by Ontario Teachers, where we own the tracks that go between London and the Channel Tunnel. And these are high-speed rail tracks, and they were built by the UK government, paid for, and land was procured and developed, et cetera. And then once it was done, there was a regulatory construct put on top of it so that there was a revenue stream, and then it was sold off. And so they took that, as soon as the project was done, they took a good portion of the capital that was spent and put that money back in their pocket for the next infrastructure project. And as DJ says, somebody else then is on the hook, which is us, to maintain those tracks, to operate them. And in fact, the regulatory construct gives an incentive to run them better and to put more trains on those tracks and have it available more than it would be otherwise. So all the incentives are in the right direction, and the government gets their money back and gets the economic benefits of a transportation project like that.
But as Ronnie Hakim pointed out, it requires the public either way being comfortable with a level of private involvement that we haven't seen in transportation here lately. Bob, building on Chris's point on HS1, you've been looking at Britain as an example for a different approach, or actually not a different approach, a potentially complementary approach to the Hudson problem.
Yeah, and as we've heard from the first two speakers, P3s are terrific if you've got some revenue streams that you can use to attract the private investors. I mean, you guys are not running charities, is from what I can tell, and even though we'd love to have you be charitable and so forth. So we have been looking at the UK. I wanted to build on something Scott, Reckler mentioned this morning, the notion that, New York was anointed by The Economist a couple of years ago as the preeminent global city. Well, number two, and a very close number two, was London, and London noted that, and over the years has been doing everything that they can to become number one. And in fact, about 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago now, the UK government and the Greater London Authority got together and issued a new economic development strategy for London with the express purpose of outdoing New York in terms of GDP and household income and so forth by 2030. And they plan to get there through a number of things, but principally through investments in the kinds of infrastructure projects that we're talking about here. The largest of which is a project called Crossrail. Marilyn Taylor and I have been leading a studio. This is the 6th year we've done research projects involving, comparative examinations of similar work in the UK, including HS1 and so forth. And this year we took a look at London Crossrail, just to understand, what they were investing in. And interestingly, this was a project that had been kicking around. There'd been talk about it for going back to the Abercrombie plan in 1943 or 44. Building a small, transit line in central London that would go east-west, through central London and so forth. Never captured the kind of public support or political support or business community support that it needed to move ahead. And it was only when they decided to expand it, the Transport for London decided to expand the scope of the project to stretch from Heathrow in the west to Docklands in the east, that it gained a critical mass of public support and business support, interestingly, and business support to the extent that the business community, the Greater London Chamber and London First and other business groups representing the major commercial property owners said, we will invest in this project because we think this is so important to the future of the economy of London. And so this is the comparative map at the same scale. On the top of London Crossrail, the red section in the middle is the new tunneling. The rest of it are existing rail lines that connect into this thing. And the little squiggle to the left is Heathrow, and the piece that goes off to the right is Docklands. And down below we have what we are modestly calling New York-New Jersey Crossrail, our version of it, which encompasses Gateway. And the phase 1A of this proposal of a 4-phase project is in fact Gateway, but we think that like Crossrail, the scope of this thing probably has to be expanded, or we have to think in larger terms if we're A, going to solve the transportation problem that's been laid out for everybody this morning, and B, if we're going to gain the critical mass, and of course the plate tectonics of New York, New Jersey politics, we have to have benefits in both states or nothing happens. Having watched ARC go down, if a project is defined in New Jersey as benefiting New York, it doesn't happen, and if it's defined in New York as benefiting New Jersey, it doesn't happen. So there got to be benefits in both states. And the other key thing in London was the notion that at key points in this project, that this would enable either the creation or expansion of new centers in the central business district. And on the eastern side, you see Canary Wharf, which is 12 minutes east of central London, and then to the west, a second new regional center built on a former rail yard called Old Oak Commons, which will be the same size. Canary Wharf currently has 105,000 employees there. It will be expanded to something like double that, close to 250,000, similar number of residents over time in Docklands. And the same thing at Old Oak Commons. We have the same problem, which is that we have this over-concentration of activities in the core. We end up with these superheated commercial markets, at the top of every economy, which is one of the things that that seems to slow down the growth of the region's economy. So we are looking at two things. One, the notion of creating new nodes or new centers in an expanded central business district where we have capacity for growth and where this Crossrail project could in fact create the accessibility needed to create value. And the idea here is to reestablish the historic link that was mentioned this morning between rail infrastructure and real estate. And we do that by creating these new nodes or these new centers in an expanded central business district. There's several places along the corridor. The two largest, one in the west at Secaucus, where there's 1,000 acres. Mr. Gottesman is here, I think, still, and owns a large chunk of it at Edison Properties, and Harts Mountain owns the rest of it. So it's already assembled. It adjoins this existing New Jersey Transit station. The only modest problem is that when the Jersey Transit trains pull in the morning, they're filled. So there's no way that you can build a lot of additional employment or residential growth there unless you create new capacity, which this project would do. Same thing on the east in Long Island City and Sunnyside, where the yards have been looked at for years, but the question, the trains don't stop there. The commuter rail trains run through, Amtrak trains run through, they yard the trains, they don't stop there. And so we'd be creating new stations, and you can see the numbers, essentially in Secaucus, or we call it Meadowlands South, the idea of a green, development that would be compatible with the natural systems and support the natural systems of the Meadowlands, but a center the size of Stamford, essentially, and something smaller but even more valuable on the Long Island City side, because we think the rents would be higher. Sketch that our students have done of what the Secaucus development might look like with a very low FAR of a little over 2.5, something like that for 800 of the 1,000 acres, and then lots of land devoted to green infrastructure and water management systems and so forth. So it could be even bigger, but this is the modest proposal we've put together. Again, the capacity that would be created here by this by this development. We'd literally double regional rail ridership in the region to 1 million and create, if you know, compare it with existing transit ridership, it's about the same set of benefits as Crossrail in London, about a 10% increase in the transit capacity of the entire tri-state region in doing this project. And again, the key investment, the first investment is Gateway, but it has to be complemented by expansion of a new Penn Station, eventually a new Penn Station that allows for through running and so forth. And then here's the punchline, and this is what gets back to our friends at Macquarie and Ontario Teachers, is that you can pull value out of these things. This is what the Vanderbilts did so brilliantly, and what the Pennsylvania Railroad used to do to build the infrastructure that we have today. And you know, if we pulled a third of the increase in property values, or I'm sorry, not property values, but sales tax revenues and property tax revenues and so forth, you know, at Long Island City, it's $12 billion that you get. This is net present value over a 45-year period. Say a smaller number at Meadowlands, because the rents would be a little lower, we think, but very substantial amounts of money. And similar and probably even larger benefits around Penn Station and the west side of Manhattan, new station on the east side of Manhattan, meeting the 2nd Avenue subway, imagine that. And then this is the punchline. In London, 2/3 of the revenues have come out of value capture, either regional value capture, business community led a campaign to create what they call a business rate supplement, a surcharge on commercial property values across Greater London. Again, the business community leading the charge on this thing. The City of London, the borough's additional 7% coming out of community infrastructure levies. These are essentially TIF districts around the stations. Some of the stations are actually being built by private investors in return for the ability to do air rights development with retail and so forth over the stations. And so 2/3 of the value actually comes from the region itself, and only a third. And what we met with the UK infrastructure people at the Treasury, and these are, boy, they make our OMB guys look like free spenders. And they said, well, what do we, you know, we said, why did you come up with a third of the cost of this thing? What convinced you that this made sense in an austerity budget and so forth? And they said, well, business community said, come in, we're ready to do a third, match us. You know, and the only possible answer was we will do that. So here's what we're suggesting for our version of it. Big project. So 15 of the 45 billion is Gateway, and including all the phases of Gateway and Penn South and so forth. But 2 additional tunnels under the East River, new stations in several locations, including the east side of Manhattan, and then links to the existing regional rail and commuter rail systems, so that you could actually, you know, it was interesting looking at the Jersey transit maps of where Jersey residents go to work in New York. They don't go east of the East River because they can't get east of the East River, even though that's the fastest growing employment center in the region. And so at any rate, we're looking at something, same thing, 2/3 of the revenues. It could be even more. And you know, there's one scenario that would have, you know, the whole thing being financed locally if in fact our federal friends decide not to belly up for a 1/3 federal share, but this shows a 1/3 federal share in terms of grants, loans, guarantees, and so forth. 2/3 of it, part of it, the same type of idea of a regional supplement on real estate, on commercial real estate, value capture on these big development parcels, and that's the majority, you know, of where it comes from. And then the states could come up with the rest of it, again, with a modest share of the increase in state income taxes and sales taxes and so forth that would be coming out of the development. So again, reestablishing the historic link, you know, between rail infrastructure and regional economic development and property development, we think can create the revenue streams. And we would love to turn around and build this thing and then turn it over to one of you guys to get, you know, if you could do the same thing with this that you did with HS1, get us $12 billion back that we could put into the MTA capital program or other things that we need to invest in, we would love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So there we have, I think, fundamentally the idea of a handful of things that would capture the value, and of course we're all familiar with the overall concept of value capture. But your point at the end there is interesting, and it led me to think about the comment that Pat Foy made earlier about the Conquering Gotham book and the story of how the tunnels were originally built, which was really the private sector not doing the financing, but actually taking the lead in defining what was necessary and in fact implementing it, yes. Right? Yes. And Alexander Cassatt, not being a banker, he was a railroader. Sam, you and I were talking a few minutes ago about kind of where where are the analogous characters? Do we need to rely on the public sector to do the planning, to do the scoping? Does it make sense to think about a more ambitious engagement with the private sector than even the PPPs that we've seen happen here and in Britain?
Yes, yes. I think first of all, we should take a step back in time and study a little bit of history, see where we are today, and then what we could think about the future. 1970, when I came out of graduate school, looked for a job with the Port Authority. Couldn't get it with the Port Authority, but I wanted to be at the Port Authority because that was the place to be, where the great minds were, where they were thinking the most forward thinking. They did the contraflow bus lane before anybody else did on the Lincoln Tunnel and increased capacity dramatically. I followed a year later with my colleagues at the traffic department doing it on the Long Island Expressway. And the people of the Port Authority were the stars in transportation. And we still have lots of those people working for the Port Authority, but one has questioned, and we've seen many questions about the leadership of the Port Authority and coming forward with those kinds of great ideas. Here we are in 2015, and if you look at the transportation model, or what's been happening in transportation, you'll see there's been a revolution, and it's almost like we aren't paying attention to it. And it's a revolution that occurred around 2003, 2004, and I remember in 2004, then Secretary of Transportation, Mary Peters, holding a chart saying by 2020, VMT could possibly double in the United States. Well, something happened in 2004, and VMT started to go down. And this preceded the recession. It continued to plummet after the recession. For 10 consecutive years, VMT went down, which is a problem for some of the P3s that are counting on that revenue. And when one looks very closely at what has happened, it's really generational. It's the millennial generation that's traveling in a different way, and they aren't relying on purchasing a car and then driving that car. They're sharing, they're using Uber, they're biking, they're walking, they like active transportation, and they love technology. So if we go ahead to 2030, should we just be running our bridges, our tunnels, the same way that we've been running them? What if we told the community, the Google communities, the high-tech communities, we will give you one tube of the Lincoln Tunnel, and your goal is to increase the number of people that go through that tube of the Lincoln Tunnel. And you will only get paid based on that increase. And you have to figure out what we're going to do with the people at the other end of the tunnel. What they may come up with are buses that are spaced 10 feet apart, and we double the capacity, as we did when we did the first contraflow lane, and have some remarkable way of moving people. They may come back and say, why do lanes have to be 11 feet wide? Why can't we put 4 lanes of traffic in the Lincoln Tunnel and have these little pods that can occupy those lanes, because you could do it safely with the Google cars of the future. By the way, I'm not a great supporter of Google cars for urban traffic, but in terms of for buses and public transportation, I think we should open the question up to the world of 2030 and say, how would you run a tunnel in 2030? And it probably is not the same way of running a tunnel today. And if we use the P3 models of counting on revenue based on the number of cars that pass through, the number of cars is going to continue to go down, and we're at real risk. And we've already seen some P3s that have failed because they failed to include the fact that people are driving less. So let's broaden our minds, open our minds up. We have great thinkers. Perhaps open it up to a worldwide competition and figure out how we can improve throughput across the Hudson River.
So a competition that would engage much of the private sector and perhaps entrepreneurs who might be the next Alexander Cassatt. I'm hearing 5 themes, and I want to ask you all to think about these together in the sense of what's the reality of how you would make this work. I've heard the theme around recycling the capital. right? That instead of, that maybe the public sector's job cannot be to build and own, it must be to build and then move on and build again. I've heard the theme of capturing the value that you create, which is, of course, a financial issue, but it requires political consent. And that relates then to the interesting question, I think, that Crossrail gives us as an example, which is how convincing it was that the people who were likely to be asked to pay for it were the ones asking for it, which is not a phenomenon that we necessarily see. And, of course, over the last 10 days, we've seen the contretemps over the simple idea that the MTA's fare might contribute towards the capital plan.
Well, that's where Reckler comes in, you see.
Fair enough. And then the idea also from Crossrail that you have to expand the project to gain public support, which is interesting because a couple of our panelists this morning were thinking about it the opposite, right, which is that incremental is easier for the public to swallow. And then what may be the most difficult item for the public to swallow above all, which is despite the observation that they don't care who runs the trains, there is this visceral fear, it seems, around private sector involvement. And what was interesting is we did hear the executive director of NJT saying that we need to educate the public about private sector involvement and get them comfortable with it. But frankly, what I think I've also heard from Chris and DJ and Sam, the institutions may need to be more comfortable than they currently are with turning over power. So I go back to my first question. What do we do first? So there are clearly ways that this could happen. Clearly this region is rich enough, it has the legal structures, the institutions, et cetera, to attract capital. And yet for 15 years we've been struggling with this simple problem of, not simple, but with this somewhat basic problem of expanding capacity. So where does it actually begin? And by the way, let's not just start with the word leadership because that's too vague. So where does it begin? I was not going to ask easy questions.
Okay, so I'm going to not answer that question, if that's okay. I'll answer it sort of glancing. I think, first of all, I want to kind of hit on something that Sam said in terms of the P3s failing. And I think that's a sort of distorted view of what a P3 is. So what happened in the P3s that, quote, failed, unquote, was the private sector came in, provided funding to the government for other projects. Traffic did not materialize that was anticipated. Private sector took a loss, right? I don't think that's the purpose of doing a P3 is to shield government from risks the private sector can manage better. And so in that case, as a P3, it succeeded, very, very well. As a project and as an investment opportunity, it did not succeed well at all. But I think it's important to understand, if you have a bankruptcy in a P3, what you're looking at is you're looking at losses that are going to be incurred by the public sector that otherwise would be losses incurred by losses incurred by the private sector that otherwise would be losses incurred by the public sector, right? So it performed exactly as it should. The other thing I'd like to touch on in terms of kind of value capture, as a public policy matter, it's always a very, very good idea if you're investing public funds in infrastructure and there's going to be an uplift that the private sector realizes to take as much of that as you can, right? So I mean, I'm very, very free market, but again, if you're using public funds to create value, the public should share in that value. The challenge in that value capture is one of timing, right? So everybody knows you build a transit station or you build an intersection, or you do anything that improves infrastructure, the property adjacent to that improvement will increase in value. Everybody knows that. What nobody knows is when and to what extent that value increase will occur. So I think value capture is very, very important, but what you're going to find from an infrastructure investment standpoint is that the investors who are investing for low returns because they want a low, stable return, so they're not asking for a lot of it. This is not venture capital, right? That those investors will want the government to stand behind the anticipated revenues, right? So I'm not sure how it worked in London. My guess is that the private sector was not taking the risk that those income taxes and property taxes and sales taxes were coming in. The government was actually taking that risk. So it's again, as it should. Yeah, as it should. So very, very good idea, but you can't, like outside of Hong Kong and maybe actually spots in Manhattan, it's going to be very, very hard to use value capture to actually finance infrastructure because the value that's there, you're not sure how, the quantum, and you're not sure the timing of it.
You know, Red, I want to go back to your fundamental question. It's not, I won't use the word leadership, but we have a little problem here. We have a region with a nice $1 trillion economy or $1.5 trillion economy. You know, that's Exhibit A out the window there. That's what we're fighting for, folks. But we're also fighting to, you know, we're competing globally. All of our competitors around the world are making these investments, and we're not. And you know, as Mr. Degnan and others said this morning, you know, the first challenge is just maintaining a bunch of 60, 80, 120-year-old infrastructure systems, which is enormously expensive. But then we have to create the capacity for growth that all the speakers this morning talked about. You know, say a 15, 20% increase in the population of the region and an even larger increase in the economy of the region. As Joel Ettinger said he didn't say it quite as clearly as I would, which is basically unless we make these investments, that growth goes elsewhere. And standards of living decline for our kids. We aging boomers may not be supported in the style to which we've become accustomed by the next generation because the money won't be there. And so somehow we have to, and the question that came up from John Porcari is gateway number one, and we got a little bit of waffle from the port because, in fact, there are other priorities. I mean, we do have to fix the bus terminal. The MTA has to maintain its system. There are a bunch of priorities in a region with an economy and an infrastructure system the size of this one. So it comes back to convincing the public that we need to really up our game and make a set of investments. And we can do it in creative ways in partnership with the private sector. But you know, we've got to make some investments. Ultimately, the public, you guys again are not running charities. You're not running bake sales and that sort of thing. That you know, it's going to have to come out of one or another pocket of every member of the public. You're going to have to pay for this stuff, and so we have to convince the public that these investments are critical to the future of the region, that there are enormous penalties to be paid, and maybe we have to have, like the audience at the assembly last week concluded, maybe we have to have a tunnel failure before we, you know, the 2x4 over the head that the public requires in this region to do anything. And it does come back to leadership. We do have to find, you know, a set of elected officials and a set of business leaders. I mean, you talked to Dick Ravitch about how the MTA was turned around, and he got David Rockefeller and Walter Wriston and a bunch of prominent business leaders to rattle chains in Albany, and that's when things started to happen. And they raised taxes and they raised tolls and so forth. One last thing, and you know, Ritt and I were both in an international transportation forum in London last year, and we were talking about fare policy. One piece I didn't mention in London. London has a 100% fare box recovery ratio. We have a 55% fare box recovery ratio. Jersey Transit's is what, probably 35 or something like that. We have to ask the public to pay for these services. That there are no free gifts around and no free lunches. So we have, and that's a big part of how you pay for these things, is that the people who benefit directly, the riders, have to belly up. You know, so I think we have to be straight with the public about what the fact that they're going to be paying for these things, but that there's an enormous penalty if we don't, and there's an enormous upside, incredible upside for this region if we can make these investments.
Yeah, I share exactly what Bob was talking about. And in the 1970s, of course, we saw our transit system deteriorate. But I was chief engineer in charge of the city's bridges. And I had to shut the bridges and I had to go public, and it probably did cost me my job ultimately. But we have to demonstrate and we have to be truthful to the public how vulnerable aged infrastructure is. And how, if we are going to maintain our stature as a world city, how we are going to have to make those investments. I did it with the bridges by closing some of the bridges. I closed the entire Williamsburg Bridge, banned trains from the Manhattan Bridge because they had to be. Cables snapped from the Brooklyn Bridge, killing a Japanese tourist going across it. Section of the FDR Drive at 20th Street collapsed. And now everybody has kind of forgotten it. We had 25 years later, oh, everything's going to take care of itself. Somehow we have to make that case it is not going to take care of itself. The reason I became chief engineer was everybody else was arrested in my agency, in the DOT. So it was by default. But while they were stealing money, there was a second scandal that was going on, and that was the scandal of not telling the truth about the infrastructure. They were writing reports that somehow the bridges were healing themselves. and the roads were getting better and fixing their own potholes. And that's all nonsense. And I think it's incumbent upon us, and I know you said, don't think of the leaders, but we can't let up on our elected officials. We have to make transportation a cornerstone of any policy that they're going forward. If we neglect the infrastructure, what we end up doing is stealing from other public needs later on, because when we waited for the Williamsburg Bridge to come near collapse, we had to spend almost $800 million, when had we taken care of it right, it would have been under $100 million. On the East River bridges, we've probably stolen $3 billion alone from that. When we look forward to the Hudson River crossings, again, if we don't do the job right, we're going to be stealing from future generations. We need the visions. Bob is giving us the visions. We need the funding options out there. Value capture, I think, is a great idea. My only concern is I can't tell you on how many different projects I've seen Long Island City value go through the roof. From Sunnyside Rail Yards and others. We've got to be careful about double and triple counting on value capture. But nonetheless, we've got to use all those tools. But we need leaders who say, this is a front burner issue, and we as citizens, and Bob and I on the Regional Plan Association are very active with Move New York and other projects to make these front burner media issues. You constantly are seeing stories that we're pressing forward on this, and it's really incumbent upon all of us to make that happen.
So I didn't want to suggest that leadership is not at all relevant, but I think too often we fall back on just we have an absence of leadership and it's left at that. I wonder, and I realize we're getting more and more,
Hey, Mike
I'm
Bloomberg,
getting
not running for mayor of London, right? So anything can happen, right?
getting more and more pointed on this, but what are the right roles? One of the things that's striking to me as I look at Crossrail is that you had a mayor who is the elected mayor of a much larger percentage of the metropolitan region than the mayor of New York is.
About the same as New York, about 8 million out of 22.
Okay, maybe, but either way, then also with a much closer connection to the national government. And, as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, he may be in the national government. And so what were the roles that put that together, and are there the analogous characters here? In part because, as Bob always points out, it goes back to the Duke of York who sold New Jersey and gave it away, and therefore we have a disjointed region. What do you think?
Well, I think we've got all the ingredients here. We've been looking at the structure of how things are managed here, and one big difference is that the mayor of London runs Transport for London, and it's the equivalent of running the subways and a growing share of the regional rail system with the overground system that TfL's taken over. That's different here, but I think it does what we need to do is mobilize the civic community, the business community. This is what Ravitch did in the early 80s around the MTA Capital Program, and then government responded. And so it seems to me that some of the folks that are in this room and are going to, well, it's the people in this room that are going to have to be the heart of this thing. We've got to provide the vision, we've got to provide the leadership, and then we've got to bring along, the key people in the business community. I did just kind of joking about Scott Reckler, but Scott's an obvious guy. He's a very successful, businessman and so forth, and clearly gets the importance of these systems. So people like Scott have got to step forward. People like the board at RPA and the partnership and other groups have got to step forward and say that this is a priority. We have to help, we always have to be there to help the elected officials do the tough things, because in the end, we're talking about people reaching into their pockets. It means somebody's got to pay for it, and unfortunately, the somebody is us. That I think despite the good intentions of the Obama administration, it's not looking really good for a long-term, federal transportation program, and it doesn't look to me like it's going to be an easy thing to get the federal government to come in for the majority of the funds that are going to be needed for this thing. So we're going to pay for it. It's got to come out of one pocket or another. And it seems to me the best way of doing that is to both tell the story of what happens if we don't make these investments. It gets really expensive, takes an enormous piece of the economy down with it. We've had that experience only 30 or 40 years ago, and we know what happens when you stop investing in these systems. And you know, you can highly correlate investments in transportation in this region with the state of the economy. And so we got a big downside that, you know, that I guess the civic community, our job is to help make that case. But then we also have to lay out the upside that in fact, you know, if the gateway, you know, 15 billion sounds like a lot of money, but in a place with $1.5 trillion economy that has the potential to have a $3 trillion economy, if we use this as one of the key investments to build the next economy of this region, it's peanuts, you know, and I think we have to help people understand that too.
Yeah, and let me kind of tie those two things together, right roles and leadership, because I do think, echoing what Bob said, is, you know, it's easy, or actually what you said, is it's easy to point to leadership and say, well, the problem is we just need better leadership. I think it's incumbent upon kind of the folks in this room to come up with a plan that involves having the right people in the right roles that can then attract that leadership. At the end of the day, these are public facilities that are used by the public, and the public's got to be strongly behind it. I think it's really important that we demonstrate some successes early on. I'm glad to hear that the Port Authority is going through their reform program, and maybe that will develop enough goodwill that then we can step out and gain the public trust to do something different. Because, you know, you're right that while the public may not care who owns the train they're on, they have shown a great interest in any transition of ownership. And around the country, as private sector gets more involved, there's probably a healthy level of skepticism. I think it can be overdone at times, but there is a fair amount of skepticism. So I think having the right people in the right roles in terms of what are the different governmental entities, what's the role of the private sector, how do we communicate that accurately to the public, but developing a package that we can take to the leadership that they can see, okay, well, this makes sense, this is something I can stand behind because this is something that actually will help me advance my interests as well.
I was going to say one additional thought is that you know, part of the story that we need to tell. Tom Wright's very good at this, and as a Jersey boy, he can do it with enormous, you know, conviction. You know, the biggest economic sector in the state of New Jersey is commuting to Manhattan. And if you take the doomsday scenario, which is looking increasingly likely that we're going to lose one of these tunnels, you know, and New Jersey is 48th or 49th among the states in job creation over the last several years since the recession. So it's not a really pretty picture right now. And then you put that additional hit to the economy of New Jersey. This is a disaster for New Jersey, and it's not good for New York either because of the numbers that Tom also had of, you know, this is where the largest share of suburban commuters are coming from to fill the offices in places like the Trade Center and Hudson Yards and so forth. So I think we have to make that case with the elected officials, but it starts with the business community, starts with the civic leadership. That's why we're here. And then we have to help, you know, public officials like Scott Reckler and John Degnan and the people they report to in Albany and Trenton understand how dire the consequences are if we don't make these investments and how positive the outcomes can be if we do. So.
And so that's, I think, the political challenge to getting this project started. I think, however, it is clear that kind of that broader role of the private sector, financing, operations, whatever, as Ronnie mentioned this morning, is a big political challenge. And I wanted in our final few minutes to ask Chris and DJ, how have you dealt with that in other places, right? Of course, when you get that backlash or when privatization is, you know, raised and people object to it, inevitably there are fears about whether it's job loss or the incentives will be misaligned or the tolls will go through the roof or whatever it is. What are the design tools that you can use in crafting a public-private partnership that get the public and the partner agencies to be more comfortable with the kind of role that you need to get the investors interested? Yeah,
and I mean, that's something that's, you know, very close to our hearts at Ontario Teachers, where, you know, we are a pension plan sponsored by the government of Ontario, so we're very sensitive about reputation and being in the press negatively. You know, on the other hand, we're pretty fortunate because we have a good reputation. You know, we're nice. We're Canadians. We're nice. You know, the school teachers of Ontario. We're not KKR or, you know, some some hedge fund that nobody knows and is making a lot of money. So, but we are very conscious of that. So we've had this in a number of places. You know, one was we own a desalination plant in Sydney, Australia, where this plant was, it's similar to High-Speed 1, where it was something the government built and then sold off afterwards and recouped their capital. But they built it, they decided during a long 4-year drought, and by the time they started construction, it rained, and it rained a lot, and still continues to rain. And so now we own it, and we don't actually expect to run it for 5 to 10 years. So it's going to sit there, and it's essentially an insurance policy. And with what's going on in California, this is often in the news lately.
How about filling up oil tankers and shipping them to Los Angeles? You guys should make a lot of money.
Well, probably should. So, and it shows up regularly in the press, people pointing fingers saying, that's a white elephant, you never should have built it. And there is some political risk there that somebody might say, yes, let's take the concession away from them and stop paying them. So we push the management team, which, we have a management team that look after a plant that's closed down. But so in their spare time, they go out and spend time lobbying politicians, making sure people understand why it was built and the implications of it not being built, and even trying to change the contracts so that the people that are paying for it, i.e. the population, get better value out of it. So maybe we run it a little bit and provide water in the interim instead of waiting for 5 years and then just turning it on. We also have, as I said, places like airports where we own Copenhagen Airport or Brussels Airport. And we have neighbors that complain about the noise, planes flying over. We have people that get stuck in customs lineups just like any other airport. And so we spend a lot of time on community outreach and, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we spend a lot of time providing better customer service. So we do surveys of people, we address their concerns, and we make that public on our website, annual reports. So it is very important to us, and it is dialogue, communication, engagement with the community.
Yeah, and so we're Australian, so we're not as nice as the Canadians, but we're fun, right? So we play on the fun factor. But Rich point is an excellent one, which is, again, the public involvement is very, very, very important. We start with kind of the macroeconomic issues, right? Listen, there's job creation, there's economic growth that's coming. That's important. Also think it's very important to make it personal, right? So the people that are using these facilities, listen, it's going to be safer. It's going to be cleaner. It's going to be more efficient. This is the type of infrastructure ultimately you want. If you go to Americans and you say, listen, do you want to pay more for infrastructure? They're like, yeah, I'm okay. As long as I get a benefit, yes, I'm happy to pay more for infrastructure. Do you want your taxes increased? No. You want to pay tolls? No. You want your taxes, other taxes? No. The problem is there tends to be a disconnect between willingness to pay and faith that if they pay, they'll get something that's of value, right? And so we try, as we develop our projects, to make that connection very, very clear. What are you paying for, and what are you getting for value in terms of that? Also, we, in part of making it personal, working on a project now in Colorado where we're replacing a viaduct. Back in the day, we thought it would be a great idea to elevate interstates so they didn't sort of bisect communities, and turns out there's wasteland underneath them. So we're going to take that viaduct, we're going to put it below ground, we're going to create a cap over the top of it and put a park on that cap, right? So it's more than just a transportation solution, it's sort of a community-based solution as well. So you get environmental benefits, you get community benefits, you get labor benefits, and you get transportation benefits. So I think it's important for us to start talking about these transportation projects in terms that are both macroeconomic and very, very personal. And then the biggest challenge, the most important component of a P3 and some of the biggest challenges is the risk shift. Sometimes there's a tendency for people to say, well, if you build it, the private sector is going to make too much, or they're going to raise rates too much, or this is going to be bad. And they tend to compare the project to this idyllic project that has actually never been constructed anywhere in the history of the world and say, well, this is not as good as that. And so we try to, without being negative and being somewhat subtle, remind them that you're not going to have cost overruns on this project, right? Because those are going to be liability of the private sector. You're not going to have schedule overruns on this project. The maintenance is going to be prepaid, so it's not going to fall apart because the government has been able to scrape resources to maintain it over the course of time. And so a good friend of mine, Pete Ron, used to be the DOT director in Missouri. And instead of doing the traditional and forgive those of you who've been involved in DOTs who've done this, but sort of the traditional mode is, listen, the bridges are falling down, infrastructure's crap, we're going to be third world in just a matter of time, we have to invest in it. He took a different tact, which is, I'm going to demonstrate to the public what it is I'm doing for them that's helping them now. What's good about this system? You know, it's put together a newsletter, communicated clearly, all of that. Did that for 2 years, then went back to legislature, I'd like a tax increase, and they gave it to him. Why? Because he demonstrated value in what he's delivering currently. So I think it's important to talk about kind of the need, but I think sometimes these conversations, we clap so heavily down the need that we think, well, if we just get people to understand the need, they'll cough up the money. That hasn't been very particularly successful in the last few decades. And I think it'd be good to focus on, we're going to give you this infrastructure, we're going to explain the macroeconomic benefits, we're going to explain the personal benefits, and we're going to explain the liabilities this change will eliminate going forward.
Excellent. We do have roving microphones, and we can take questions for 10 or 15 minutes. So, Dan, I think you've got one back there.
Thank you. Lee Goodman, formerly manager of transportation planning for the Port Authority, and now a transportation professor at Pratt Institute. And I'm just going to pick up on something that Sam said. He mentioned the contraflow bus lane. I'm a specialist at putting things in that people don't know anything about and don't want. And then after they're put in, they don't want to take it away. So just give me a little slack here. This meeting focuses on critically important passenger movement, Trans-Hudson. But we should think also about something that was in the meeting announcement, and I'm quoting it. It says, address the current state of the transportation network linking New York and New Jersey and alternatives for increasing the capacity of that network. That's a little broader than Trans-Hudson. In addition, the Port Authority's Regional Interstate Report, which was cited before, considers goods movement as well as passenger movement. And the paper notes that the northern sector, meaning basically the George Washington Bridge, handles most of the freight flows from outer boroughs, Long Island, and New England. This results basically, this is my opinion now, this results from the lack of a viable, more direct route using the Verrazano Bridge. Thousands of trucks therefore are using time, money, and energy wasting what I call great circle routes, using very lightly traveled roads, like
Sir, is there a question? Sorry.
Yes, I'm getting to the question.
Okay.
I have to just set the scene for a minute. Using the great circle routes, using the Turnpike, the bridge, and the Cross Bronx, or other lightly traveled routes like the Verrazano, the Gowanus, and the Long Island Expressway. And the paper also mentions the Cross Harbor Rail Freight Tunnel, which will take about 150 peak-hour trucks off the George and the Verrazano. And that's a very small piece of the 20,000 vehicles that are using the George and the Verrazano in the one-way peak hour. So long-term, this gets to my question. The freight rail improved regional network, that is after the tunnel, if you ever build a tunnel, would need more cross-harbor freight truck capacity and more time and energy-efficient roadway linkage from Staten Island, New Jersey to Long Island. So I'm interested in the panel or anybody else telling me, this is the question, how these important regional issues will be addressed. They're not passenger issues, but they're issues that the people in the region should be concerned with, but they don't think about it. They just want their material at Costco. They don't care how it got there, but that's how it gets there. And in these planning initiatives, whatever is going to be done, I suggest that you consider there's another gateway project in this region. I called it this in 1997. It was called the Multimodal Gateway Project, New York, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, which has interstate elements which address the needs that I identified, and which would also have transit benefits for Staten Island and Brooklyn. But so basically the question is, how are we going to address, in addition to the passenger movements, and making sure that we have a very full plate already, as this meeting demonstrates, but we want to make sure we have everything on the plate, because these will require funding also and are very important for the region. How are we going to address these points also? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you've raised a very important issue. Unfortunately, it was probably very well directed at this morning's panel, but not so much for ours. Are there questions related to the challenge of this panel, which is in financing the network? Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Well, from himself as the.
So let me set the stage for my question.
I think you're allowed, sir.
The question I have is for the two experts from the Ontario Teachers Fund from Macquarie. How do you reconcile, let me preface this by saying I was a member of the 10-people consortium in New Jersey who supported Governor Corzine's proposal to monetize the value of the Turnpike Authority, which was killed virtually instantly by political forces. How do you reconcile, or in your experience, how have you, the need for regulatory oversight of the charges passed along to consumers, either through tolls or, in the case of the port, the fees that are charged, with the need to make a return for the private investor? Have they generally been balanced in a feasible way? And one point I might make about the Port Authority, and Pat, I see you over on the other side, correct me if I misstate any of this, but we have an unusually successful history in this regard. I'm not aware of much resistance to the Goethals Bridge proposal, nor, for example, to the sale by lease to Larry Silverstein of the World Trade Center in 2001, nor any public blowback to the LaGuardia P3 partnership, which is under consideration now. I wonder why that is. It may be because people just don't give a damn what the Port Authority does, or because those public assets are not viewed truly as public assets, but the assets of an authority. So, thank you.
I mean, I guess the question is, how do you prevent the private sector sponsor or owner from making too much money from the asset that they bought? And, I think there are mechanisms out there that that account for that. I mean, one is, on one hand, you also have to also imagine that the private sector investor is coming in and making a bet, and they make the bet, and they might lose some money, and they might make some money. And so there does need to be a balance on that, and they might make money through their own ingenuity, and they might make money from luck. And then overlaid on top of that, you need to look at whether you're fine with that or whether you allow some complication to be put on so that the government or the seller can recapture some of that money. And that can be done through a regulatory construct of some sort where there is a reset. So a lot of regulated assets, you're incented to spend money, but if it's a passenger-based rate and the passengers are higher than they were supposed to be, then you just reset the rate on the next regulatory period. So every 5 years, maybe you claw back and there's a reset of how much the investor can make. I mean, in other jurisdictions, the government retains a stake in the asset is another thing where, and this works best where, in my opinion, as a private investor, where the government takes a largely passive stake or not a controlling stake and allows the private sector to retain control of the asset. But in that case, they're there and they're aligned that should more money be made, then the government is there to also make the money. And then a third one, which is more back-ended, is some sort of long-term lease. So it can be 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. The longer the lease is, the more money you get up front. But the shorter it is, the sooner you get the asset back. And it's typical lease terms where it needs to be given back in a good state of repair. And for a building or facility or road or something, it's generally still going to have a very long life as opposed to something mechanical that might have a defined 20 or 30-year life already. So there are mechanisms to deal with it.
Sorry, Chris.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've put your finger on the exact issue why people have skepticism about these, because they understand the private sector has a profit motive, and that's primarily what's driving the private sector, and they're concerned that that motive will overcome, in essence, what is in the public interest. And so these contracts are written that way. So in terms of setting the toll rate, that's in the concession agreements. The private sector can't show up one day and say, okay, we want to raise tolls, right? For very legitimate reasons. I mean, the private sector, that profit motive is a great way to incentivize innovation. It's a great way to incentivize cost savings. It's a great way to shift risk. But it's not going to generate a public interest solution. So you need to put those elements in the concession agreement. So what are the maintenance conditions of the road? The other concern is, okay, well, if they have a profit motive, they'll just not maintain the road. It's like, well, no, because the agreement that they have that allows them to collect tolls also forces them to maintain the pavement at a certain condition, to replace guardrails, to remove dead animals, to have the signage done. So these are large contractual agreements where, you know, from a public policy standpoint, that profit motive is checked to make sure that it's channeled in a way that does promote the public interest. So we have a presentation as a slide, and, you know, one of the slides is government stays in control. Government owns the road, government sets the rate, government sets the maintenance condition, government receives the road back in a pre-described level of condition at the end of it. So a fair amount of, I think, the education that needs to be done if you do move in a P3 direction is to help the public understand that those public interest elements are taken into account in these transactions and are protected.
DJ, maybe you can help me understand something about P3s. One of the things and one of the concerns, and this occurred in California, is while the P3 agrees to do the maintenance and does, you know, the construction and maintains the levels of service, there are sometimes P3 covenants in the agreements against competition.
Yep.
And sometimes government would like to build something new and build something that might take some revenue away from a P3. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So this is an early day SR 91, which is a highway in California coming from LA out to the east, between a mountain range through a valley, and so there was really no way to compete against that facility. This is first generation P3 contract, and what they had in there was a provision that said, in essence, because the private investor is investing in this road and anticipating this level of traffic, the government cannot build a competing facility. There are no contracts like that anymore. That was a bad contract, right? So it was an early stage contract. It made sense at the time. It was basically the only way you were going to finance that first project. But now what you have, kind of building on what Chris said, is the private investors will come in and they're going to assume a STIP. Right? They're going to assume that you have these highways built today. You're going to build these highways over the next 20 years. Their investment case is based on that. The government always has the right to change the contract and build competing facilities, but they'll have to compensate the concessionaire if they change it in a way that was not foreseen in the original transaction, right? So, which makes sense. Like, you can't come in and say, we want you to invest in this, you know, we want you to buy this McDonald's, and then, oh, we're going to build 3 on every other corner across from you after you've bought this one. So it's essentially, you know, some of the protections you would find in a franchise agreement are also found in these. But that is a criticism that's brought up frequently. There are non-compete restrictions, but in fact, in the Indiana Toll Road, you couldn't build an interstate within 10 miles north or south for longer than 40 miles without paying compensation, which, you know, you're not going to build an interstate within 10 miles for longer than 40 miles under any circumstances. But the concessionaires felt like, okay, well, Indiana gets up one morning, they want to build an interstate parallel to the Indiana Toll Road. They fundamentally changed the terms of this deal. It's a 75-year deal. I'd like some protection against that.
We have time for, I think, one more. Right up front.
Thanks.
Where's our mic? Oh, okay.
Rhett, one of the things we've talked about in the financing, you know, we've talked about, you know, the projects and the financing. One thing we have not touched on, and yeah, I hate to tell Chairman Degnan, but the Golf Hills Bridge, for those of us who are old enough to remember, the battle that we had the first time getting the first EIS that got passed, and then we couldn't build it for 10 years because of all the opposition we had for 10 years, that was pretty painful. So even the Port Authority has had some rough battles. But one of the things is the environmental process, and, you know, Pat, Pat has talked often about that. The risk associated, you mentioned the various risks, DJ, and Chris, you've touched on some of them. But one of the things, obviously, is time equals money. You know, Jim and I were talking about how some of these projects, it's also the cost. It's not just the financing, but, you know, how do you get the cost down on some of these projects? And the issue is, how, you know, the question out of that is when you look at the risk of the environmental process and the time delay and that what that does both for financing and costs, do you see any good models? Or what do you know, we've seen maybe Tappan Zee Bridge, we've seen a few that are coming along, but still, I think from the private sector, when you start looking at mega projects, forget even the normal overruns, you know, for things you don't anticipate construction-wise, but just all these other risks. Do you see any good models that we should be looking at?
I mean, from a private sector perspective, I think the private sector is held to the same standard as the public sector is on environmental laws and environmental permitting. So, how to get through that process faster, I don't think the private sector is going to offer any solution to that. They might have more creativity only from a resource perspective, but otherwise they're being judged by the same agencies. And then who holds the risk usually of a new piece of infrastructure and who does the environmental permitting? I mean, it's tough to say, hey, we want a road from A to B, and, now that you've bid, you got to deliver it come hell or high water, and you need the environmental permit. Nobody would step into that. It's usually, in practice on that type of thing, the government would get the permit and say, look, the permit is in place, and there might be some other things that need to be done, but it can't be highly uncertain like environmental permitting.
Do you see other examples of where the process has worked better than it is working in this district, in this region?
Yeah. I mean, I think to echo what Chris said, so I was involved in SR 125 out in California, the South Bay Expressway, where California decided to experiment with having the private sector involved in the environmental process. Unmitigated disaster, because basically the Caltrans and the resource agencies were like, well, the private sector can't come in the room while we're having these conversations because they have a vested interest, and that would sort of complicate the no-build alternative. So involvements of the private sector early in the environmental process have not been particularly fruitful. I do give kudos to the administration in their everyday counts and their dashboard processes, where, in particular in Tappan Zee Bridge, where they've done a very effective job of helping focus the lead agency, in those cases Federal Highways, and the resource agencies on getting through the environmental process in a sensible amount of time. I think, to be honest with you, we need to fundamentally look at our environmental review process. It's way outdated. It generates reams and reams of paper that nobody ever reads. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to, if not billions of dollars, to projects nationwide, and doesn't really produce the benefit it's designed to produce, which is kind of protect the environment and then mitigate as much as possible when possible.
And I could not imagine a more perfect question, Kevin, or a more perfect answer, DJ, to lead us into our break and into our final panel in 15 minutes or so, when we will be talking about how important it is to think differently about the various processes that lead to getting shovels into the ground. I want to thank my panelists, Chris, DJ, Bob, and Sam. It's a great conversation. Thank you.